This is going to be Chapter 2, Section 4, River Dynasties in China. The geography of China includes many natural barriers, such as the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the Pacific Ocean, the Gobi Desert, the Talicaman Desert, which is not labeled on this map, but if you look where it says Asia, that was placed on the Talicaman Desert, the Plateau of Tibet, and the Himalayas. The Plateau of Tibet is also not labeled on this map, but between where it says Asia and Himalayas is where you would find it. Like the other cultures that we have discussed in the civilizations of the river valleys, China relies on two rivers for its irrigation and its crop growing. The Honghe, which translates as the Yellow River, and the Changjiang, which translates as the Yangtze, bearing in mind that my pronunciation is probably dreadfully off. So, I mentioned that the Honghe translates as the Yellow River. It also has other nicknames, including China's Pride, China's Sorrow, and the River in the Sky. The reason China's Pride is one of the nicknames is because it's a long river running 3,000 miles through China and carrying with it a very fertile form of silt called loess. The difference between loess and regular silt is just washed down by the river. Loess tends to be wind-blown. In this case, the wind blows it into the river and it gets washed down like silt anyways, but it's a different grain. It's much finer than regular silt, which is much more of a thick mud. The Honghe is the dirtiest river in the world. 1 cubic foot of river water is considered to contain about 2 pounds of this loess silt dirt in it. The nickname China's Sorrow is given to the Honghe because of the frequent flooding, disastrous flooding that has been known to kill millions. In an effort to control the floods, the early Chinese built levees. As we learned in the last section with the Harappans, levees are walls built to hold back the floodwater. Unfortunately, what this did was trap the river inside the riverbed, preventing it from dropping all that loess, that dirt, onto the surrounding soil. This settles to the bottom, raising the bottom of the riverbed, which in turn raises the water level until it ends up flooding again. Levees are built higher. This repeats, silt settles, water level rises, levees have to be built higher, and so on. At current, the levees are approximately 60 feet tall, and the bottom of the river inside the levees is actually 30 feet above the ground level outside the levees. This is where it gets that other nickname, River in the Sky. In order for a civilization to grow crops, they require land that is good for growing. This is known as arable land. When we talked about Egypt, for example, you had Kemet and Deshret. Kemet was the arable land where they were able to grow the crops. Only about 10% of China is good for the crops, arable land, and it's pretty much between the two rivers. So a lot of people wonder if they've got the problem with the flooding from the Honghe, why would they keep living there? The alternative is not to be able to produce enough food. A chance of dealing with a flood versus a certainty of starvation. People kept moving back and risking the flood. Before China began keeping written records, there was an oral tradition, a story passed by words tradition, of a dynasty called the Shai Dynasty. Now, supposedly this began with an advisor named Yu, who was supposed to help out a ruler named Shun. Now, according to the legend, Yu was an engineer, and he designed the levee and irrigation systems that helped control the floods. Not stop them, but make it better for China. And in recognition of Yu's devotion to helping the people of China, before Shun died, he named Yu the next emperor. Yu then passes the power to his son, who passes it to his son, and so forth, creating the Shai Dynasty. While the story is that Yu was a great emperor, over time, the dynasty is alleged to have become corrupt. And Jie, the last ruler, was said to be a tyrant, abusive, treating the people like crap. And what happens is eventually the weather turns bad, disasters, poor farming, and the people blame the emperor, Jie. A rebellion begins. This is led by Tang. When Jie is overthrown, Tang becomes a new emperor, new family, starts a new dynasty, the Shang Dynasty. And the first thing he did was lower taxes and do generous acts for the people. In contrast to the guy before who had been a tyrant, the people of China loved the new power coming in through the Shang dynasty. Under the Shang dynasty, China developed its writing system and written records. The benefit of the Chinese style of writing, in which each symbol stood for a syllable in the pronunciation, is that even with different dialects, different versions of Chinese, everybody could read the same language even if they couldn't speak the same language. The drawback is, with this many characters for each sound combination, each syllable, there are thousands of characters. To be considered kind of literate, maybe to be able to read a newspaper or so, a person would have to memorize 1,500 or so of these. Chinese culture then and now focuses a lot on the family, so much so that the family name is considered before the individual name. Sort of like if you were to say your last name first, first name last. George Washington would have been Washington George. The family name comes first. Social classes were strictly divided, commoners at the bottom, nobles at the top. And the religion of China, not so much into the gods, even though they did have a god called Tian. It was more about the ancestors, the family. You wouldn't pray to the god, you would pray to grandpa to watch over you, or some other deceased ancestor. In the pictures here, it depicts, on the left, an old artistic rendition of family at the altar for the ancestors, while on the right you see a modern equivalent. Shang emperors wanted to know the will of the ancestors and the spirits, so they would use what was called oracle bones. These bones, sometimes the shoulder blade of an ox for example, would have questions written on them. Then they would be heated till they cracked. When they cracked, a supposed expert in the subject would then read the cracks, kind of like people who do palm reading and whatnot, and claim to give the answers from the ancestors as to the questions. Okay, this is a bit long. It's a primary source reference. Instead of reading the whole thing here, you can pause it, read it on your own if you'd like. The short version is that eventually the Shang dynasty also became corrupt. The last emperor was Shang Jin, who, according to the stories, created a large pool that he filled with alcohol, had an island in the center of it with a tree that the cooks would hold roast meat on, and then he and his friends would take canoes out there, little rowboats, along with some lady friends, and dip over the side for alcohol, float under the tree to pick the meat, and basically pamper themselves all day long at the expense of the people who were going hungry. It would be Zhao Wu who would rise up against that last ruler of the Shang dynasty. Now, according to the story, as Wu was approaching the palace with the army and had Jin surrounded, Jin was said to have gathered up all of his treasures and let the house on fire to commit suicide rather than being caught by his enemies. On finding Jin's body, Wu still shot it 3 times with arrows in order to make sure he was dead, then had the head cut off and put on display in order to show his victory. To confirm the victory and justify it, the Zhao leaders created the idea of the Mandate of Heaven. They said it was okay for them to take over because the previous dynasty had become corrupt. Now this new idea, this Mandate of Heaven, actually gets put all the way back, and they claim the other dynasty had to go through the same thing to acquire it, the blessing of the ancestors, the favor of the gods. Even though the previous dynasty had no idea what this was, it was retroactively, after the fact, put to them as well. Now, this concept of a mandate of heaven, a blessing of the gods, led to what was called the dynastic cycle. The idea that to gain the mandate, somebody takes over from someone who's become evil, and that over time, the new dynasty becomes corrupt, that a natural disaster of some sort signals that the people have lost the mandate of heaven, and that triggers a new rebellion, which allows a new dynasty to take over, claiming that they gained the mandate of heaven and are blessed because they're going to rule with more honor than the predecessors. The Zhao dynasty did a lot of changes to the government, including establishing the concept of feudalism. Pay close attention to feudalism because it's going to show up again in Japan and again in the European Middle Ages. Feudalism is the idea that the highest ranked person, in China the emperor, basically owns all the land. and he gives you some of it in exchange for military loyalty, which you then can break down to people below you for the same deal. They support you, you support them. And the idea of it was that each area could defend themselves against attack, but had to answer to the higher up emperor in case of all-out war. Other changes under the Zhou dynasty were the construction of roads, canals for water, a money system, and the development out of the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age for weapons and tools. In the end, the feudal system that the Zhou dynasty had set up would actually become their undoing. By having the individual areas able to defend themselves, it created a loss of central control. Eventually, the local areas began to turn on each other. The Zhou began to lose power. After an invasion of the capital, they even had to retreat out of it. China broke apart from one large country into several small areas that were at battle with each other. This period in Chinese history is known as the period of warring states. This is where we're going to end with China for now. We're going to pick up with it in another section where we will discuss some of the things that come out of this period and how China recovers from it.